So when we look at racial construction, and again we're talking about identity here, we see how it's kind of formulated through these kind of historical experiences, right? Socio-historical experiences. So a lot of times people have said, again, I don't see race. It's not something that's important to me. Most of those people are either ignorant or kidding themselves, because race is the first thing we ever notice on a person. All right. A lot of times when we think of race, though, we think of race as something very fixed, right? Something that you're kind of born with. Like, for example, all Mexicans know how to do blank, right? This or that, whatever it may be. So a lot of times we think it's kind of in our blood, and that's a very common argument. Now, this all comes from a historical process that goes back to medieval Europe, where they developed the concept of blood and race, and it's become so tied into the way we think of race that it makes it very problematic. So race is not something that's an essence, right? You don't know how to be Mexican just because your parents are Mexican. It's something that that you learn as life kind of goes on, right? So it's not fixed, it's not concrete, and it's not objective. But rather, race is something that is defined by conflicts, right? And certain interests that people have, a lot of times, which is based on human bodies. So we can look at African American. It's the most obvious example that we have, is that the way they were categorized was through a social conflict, right? A major conflict called slavery. So it's not that they wanted to define themselves as black. They see themselves just as human beings, but through this history, right, this long history of oppression and subordination, African Americans have been defined in a particular way just because of their color of their skin. And again, other groups have gone through this experience too. So when we talk about race, it is a very kind of complicated issue, because race it's a tough category to define, because there's so many different skin tones, right? Just particularly us that are Mexican Americans, we vary through the spectrum. I'm sure some of us might be very light skinned, might even look Euro-American, while others of us are more indigenous or even African, kind of descendants, right, in our family tree, because African people were brought into Mexico. So it's very hard to, when we talk about race, it just depends on what context you're talking about race. It's very hard to define this is what race is. However, so this cartoon right here, this picture right here, yes, there's only one human race, and that sounds something nice to say, but when we talk about race formation, this is where it gets really complicated, because race formation shapes the way we look at people. So when it comes to race formation, how did I become defined as a particular group? Well, it's part of a historical practice, as I talked a second ago about slavery, right? Slavery shapes the way we look at, people of color. A lot of these things come out of stereotypes, and these stereotypes are not just general statements. They come from a time and place. So for Mexican Americans, we've always been defined as dirty, as bringing diseases. Now, this kind of goes back to the 1900s, where Mexicans were migrating to the United States, and sometimes there were outbreaks of diseases in Mexican American communities, not because of their fault, but because the city never cared about these communities, and they never picked up the trash. There were no sewer lines. The community was never kept clean by the city. So it's not their fault that these things happen, yet they're the ones who get the blame because they're perceived to be dirty and so forth, right? So these things are part of a historical practice. So I will give the example of slavery. Another idea as to how we construct race is this concept of hegemony. where a dominant group uses these concepts to minimize the status of other people, particularly minority groups, right? Hegemony, here we're talking about specifically about race, but I'll give you an example about gender. We kind of say, well, women are better at taking care of the home because women are nurturers, right? So that's not a fact that all women are like this, but this is a way that men talk about women in order to control their bodies. And it's not an oppressive way, right, like slavery, but rather it becomes this kind of common sense. Well, of course women know how to take care of the house because that's what, it's in their blood, right? Those kind of arguments. So it becomes this kind of common sense of mentality. And it almost becomes, and I put this in quote, right? It becomes almost a truth where we just accept it. Oh, of course Mexicans work out in the fields because they're just better at it, And again, these are just stereotypes that they're not oppressive in the sense of, kind of physical violence, but rather they subordinate another group for the profit of a different group. Oh, there's the example about men and women, right? Another example that you see, again, this is not race, but this is looking at language, where English people are better than Irish people. And if you ever look at films, when you have the upper crust of society, they always give them kind of like a British accent. When people are perceived to be dumb, they give them a very either Irish or even Northern Europe, Northern England, such as like a accent from Liverpool or Manchester or something like that. So these stereotypes are very much so used in many different ways to minimize the groups that have no power. So let's look at certain terminology. So a lot of times, again, the dominant group says, well, these people don't want to be like us, right? Mexican Americans don't want to assimilate. Understand that there's a history to that where Mexican Americans were not allowed to move into certain neighborhoods. They wanted to live in some of the well-off suburbs of the 1940s and 50s and into the early 60s, but there were laws against that, right? So these things don't come out of a vacuum. So when we look at different Chicano terminology, different Chicano identities, every word has a place and time. I'm sure you might use one of these that's located here, and that's fine. But I want you to also understand that these words come from a particular experience. The first one is Hispano, and this word emerges in the 18th century. So people that migrated from Mexico to New Mexico, kind of established roots there, tended to define themselves as Hispanos. It definitely has this kind of connection to Europe. There is a sense of shame to be Native American. But definitely, up to 1950s and 60s, you still see people from New Mexico being very proud of calling themselves Hispanos because it has a connection to Spain. But it comes out of late 1700s, 1800s. Another word is Latino. It's probably a word that you might all use. This is a fairly modern word in the context of Chicano history. It really begins to take hold in about the 1980s, and it's used somewhat as an umbrella term because it includes everybody. So when we say somebody's Latino, it's not specific to a particular region, but rather very generic in a way that just identifies people from Latin America that are living here in the United States. So it could be somebody that's Puerto Rican, Cuban, Mexican, even Brazilian, right? And Peruvian, or so it's very general. So it's a useful term, but at the same time, we have to understand that it limits to explain the multiple identities within this umbrella term, right? Mexican Americans are very different from Cuban Americans, and their politics are 180, right? Completely different from each other, and along with other things. The word Mexican American, this is a word that maybe many of you use, which is fine. The word Mexican American comes out of the Great Depression, about the 1930s, and a lot of it has to do because they were trying to distinguish themselves from their parents. Their parents were Mexicanos, and in the Great Depression started deporting a lot of Mexican people. So this new generation that was coming of age during the Great Depression were trying to tell the U.S., hey, look, we're not like our parents, or people who recently arrived. We were born here, we're U.S. citizens, or at the very least we lived here a long time, and we're different. We somewhat assimilated to American culture, whereas our parents probably still maintain that kind of Mexican identity. And again, it's a very political term because many of them didn't want to be deported. There's great stories about some of them actually being deported. There's a movie called Mi Familia. If you're ever on YouTube, you can watch it for free. And it kind of talks about this experience that Mexican Americans went during the Great Depression. And it wasn't a very positive experience. So, this term does have these notions of assimilation to some extent. The next word is Mexican. This word really associated with a country, right? Whereas these are more identities, because there's no Hispano country, right? No Latino country or Mexican American country. Mexico does exist, right? And many of us use this term, understandably so, because our parents are from Mexico and our parents wanted us to be Mexican. So we use this term because partly it might be easier, but we also identify with it because of our cultural background. Understand too that Mexico is very diverse. So somebody from Mexico City is very different from somebody from Oaxaca or the Yucatan or from Sinaloa. So it's definitely kind of defining a boundary, a political boundary that focuses on the country of Mexico itself. Another kind of geographical identity is Tejano. Sorry. The word Tejano is obviously connected to the state of Texas, where Mexican Americans in Texas take great pride in this identity, and they use it to self-identify. I have many friends that are, for whatever reason, very proud to be from Texas, and they have the whole mentality of don't mess with Texas. Maybe some of you have it too. But it's very regional identity, where they don't see themselves as Mexicanos. Maybe they don't see themselves as Chicanos, but rather as Tejanos. So somebody from Arizona would not call themselves Tejanos, or somebody from California. The word Hispanic, now this one's a little bit problematic because even though a lot of people say, well, it's just this word up here in English. Well, obviously it comes from it, but this word actually emerges around the 1980s. The 1980s is known as the decade of the Hispanic, and it's a government term. So whenever you filled out some kind of government document where you had to put your race, Hispanic was the category that was put there. Understand that America is built really on two racial categories, black and white. And as more groups kind of come in, they started adding these in between those two kind of major categories. And Hispanic was one that defined this new group. Mexican Americans, again, our identity is in our history so complex that in the 1920s we were considered white, and then in the 1930s we were considered non-white, again because of the Great Depression. So they started creating these new terms, at least from the government's perspective, in order to use to identify this group. And like the word Latino, it's a very, very much so an umbrella term that encompasses everybody, like Puerto Ricans and Cubans and Mexicanos and Salvadoreños and so forth. And many people don't like it, number one, because it was given to you, right? The government said, this is what you're going to be called. And number two, because like Latino, it's kind of limited in how it defines people. The second to last is the word Chicano, Chicana. Now, this word comes out of the 1960s, and prior to the 1960s, many some people used it, particularly in barrios, and it is argued that it comes from the word Mexicano, because as Mexican Americans are settling in the Southwest, places like California, they begin to have kids that are born on this side of the border. And yes, their parents were Mexicans, and by de facto they're Mexican, but their parents never really saw them as Mexicanos. Their parents saw them as half a Mexican. So some people say it's an Aztec word. Other people have kind of said that it derives from the word Mexicano, right? Take out the ME, that you're half a Mexican. And this kind of refers as a kind of derogatory remark, right? That basically meant that you were a pocho, right? You're not a full Mexican, you're a fake Mexican. And in the 1960s, Mexican Americans started using this word as a political term because even though it had a negative connotation, many Mexican Americans saw this word as something that resonated with who they were. And then the last one, I have this here because it's been brought up quite significantly in the last couple years, is the word Latinx. So it's like the word Latino, Hispano, Hispanic. It's an umbrella term that encompasses all these groups, but it's also gender neutral and non-binary, whereas most of these, with maybe the exception of Mexican and Hispanic, are very specific to a gender, right? Mexicano, Tejano, Chicano, and so forth. This is not gender neutral, so anybody can use it. And it also is connected to the LGBTQ community. Like I stated earlier, it kind of limits as to how some people might identify, maybe more in a national political spectrum. This word is useful, right, where you can build coalitions with Puerto Ricans and Cubans in some of their fights that are going on in the community, partly because we're becoming more global. But when it comes to personal identity, some people have argued that it doesn't define their experience because it's just too general, right? So like I said earlier, being Cuban and Mexican are just two completely different things, that we do have a shared language maybe. But even that's different too, right? So these are just some of the terms, and we won't use all of them. We'll talk about some here and there, but I just wanted to expose you to some of this stuff. We'll stop it there, and I'll talk about one last thing and have you do an assignment.